everyone, and welcome to my home experiment series. I'm your science teacher, Miss Ho, and in this video, we are going to learn to make our own version of modeling clay. This is one of the easiest experiments that you can do at home, and it's safe even for little kids. So all you need for this particular experiment is some flour, some salt, water to bind it all, and optionally food coloring. Even if you don't have food coloring, it still would work. It's just that your modeling clay will just be plain old white, kind of boring. So the food coloring is just to give it a little bit of pop so that you can have more fun with your modeling clay. Now, what kind of flour do we actually need to use? Or flour, as we call it in Malaysia. You can actually use any kind of flour. You can use wheat flour, multi-purpose flour, bread flour. I have tried them all and they all work. So if you happen to have any expired flour or salt that happens to be sitting in your larder and you're like, oh, what a waste to just throw them all away. This is one of those very safe and fun experiments that you can do with your kids, or you can do them on your own, where you can just use up that flour and just have a lot of fun at the same time. Now, you don't actually need to, but in my case, I'm going to wear some gloves because the food coloring kind of gets all over our hands and I do need to save my hands for other videos that I plan to do. Now, you don't actually need the gloves because as you can see, everything is pretty safe, and as long as you use food stuff like food coloring, you're using flour, using salt, and you use boiled water, it's pretty safe even if it gets into your mouth or your kids' mouths. So if you don't mind that you and your kids get your hands a little bit dirty, then you don't need the gloves. Otherwise, if you do have gloves and you want to wear them, by all means, go ahead. Now, first of all, let's make sure that we have our raw materials ready. We have the flour, the salt, water, and the optional food coloring. Let me first show you how to make the basic modeling clay without the colors. We're going to put aside the food coloring. So that means in this first round, we're going to learn to make just plain old white modeling clay. It's a very simple ratio of 1:1. Basically, we will put equal amounts of flour and salt, which means for every spoonful of flour, we will put 1 spoonful of salt. The water is just to bind the flour and salt together. So how much water we put? I'll show you. So first, let's get our bowl. And we're going to use a spoon. So we put 1 spoonful of flour and 1 spoonful of salt. So now this is a very small amount, but let me show you how this can already bind to make the modeling clay. You don't need very much water. In fact, you just need a few drops. Just going to take another spoon so that we don't wet the earlier spoon. And we can keep that spoon for getting more salt and flour as we need it. And you can see that it's starting to bind. This is already forming the base of our modeling clay. And you can use your hands actually to start to create shapes. Now ideally the modeling clay shouldn't be very wet. So if you feel that there's a lot of moisture, what we can do is we add more flour and salt to absorb the moisture to make this a little bit drier. So I'm going to take another spoonful of flour and another spoonful of salt. Okay. And then we're going to mix that again together. And you can see how it's starting to dry up a little bit. Now if you have excess flour and salt like this, you can add just a smidge more of water. I'm going to use my hands now because when we go by feel, you can start to feel how dry or how wet the clay is and whether you're able to adhere together or not. Now I can feel that the modeling clay is a bit wet, so there's a lot of flour and salt that's still in the bowl. So I'm using this piece and pressing it down to let the moisture pick up on that extra flour and salt. And you can see that we're already starting to get a shape. If I roll this into a sphere, you can see how a sphere is starting to be formed, or you can even make it into a sausage roll, or even make other shapes. And this is the basics of how you can make your own modeling clay. Now I didn't use gloves this round because it's pretty clean, there's no coloring, but now I'm going to show you how to add food coloring to get some color into our clay. So for this, I'm going to wear gloves. Okay, the gloves that I had just suddenly broke, so I'm going to be wearing these kind of polythene gloves instead, which actually work as well, as long as they're able to protect my hands. Alright, so now how do we add food coloring? The best practice I found is not to add food coloring directly to the modeling clay that we are making, but instead add the food coloring to water and then use the colored water as the binding material for the flour and salt. So let me show you an example. Now I'm going to add some water into this bowl where we're going to add some coloring in here. So let's start with some green color. How much coloring you put depends on how dark you want your modeling clay to be. So I'm not going to add too much. Okay, that was probably a lot, but you know what? We're just going to go with it. Okay, we're going to mix up that color. Okay, so now, same thing, we're going to add a bit of flour, a bit of salt in equal amounts. So now to add color, instead of using the plain colorless water, we're going to use the water that we have colored. So I'm probably quite messy and you probably wouldn't do this, but I will reuse the spoons because I don't really want to wash up so many things. I've probably added a bit too much water here, so I'm going to add some flour and some salt. I'm going to mix that in. If the flour and salt are not binding and they're separated like this, that just means you need to add a bit more colored water. And you can start to see we're starting to get a little bit of the green modeling clay. So I'm just going to keep mixing it with my hands and try to get it all to be a uniform green color. So if you find that it's still a bit sticky, again, just add more flour and salt. And use the moisture from that modeling clay bit to pick up that additional flour and salt so that it becomes less sticky. You can start to see you already get the modeling clay just like this. And that's how you make your own modeling clay. What if we were to add the color directly to the modeling clay that we formed just like this? Well, you actually can, but it's just that the colors won't look so good. Here's an example. Say we add the color directly. I'm going to use red this time. And you know how kids would be kids, they could probably add a bit too much coloring. So when you add too much color, I'm going to show you what if I just add a few drops of color. Oops, I think that's already more than a few drops. That's way too much now. The color won't be uniform, and in fact the color kind of gets everywhere. And if you weren't wearing gloves, the color would now be all over your hands. This looks like a crime scene, and it doesn't look good. The color is not quite evenly distributed. And it looks quite terrible actually. So as you can see, my gloves are now completely covered in the color. So if you weren't wearing gloves, the color would be all over your hands. The color is way too dark. If you like this color, that's good. Personally for me, I don't like this kind of coloring because it really looks like a crime scene right now. But if it works for you, this is an option. Otherwise, my recommendation is add the food coloring to some water and then use that colored water as part of the process of making the modeling clay, just like we did initially. Now let's take a look at some common problems in making the modeling clay and how to troubleshoot. First of all, I'm going to get rid of these gloves and get a fresh pair because it really looks like I've done an autopsy over here. Now here's what it looks like when you have too much flour. Now when you have too much flour, it gets very flaky and it looks just like this. So how do we fix this problem? What you do is just add more salt. So when you add the flour and salt in the correct ratio, you will find that they will start to bind properly and form the modeling clay with the correct consistency. Now when you don't have enough water, this is what you will get. You'll find that it gets very dry and flaky, and you get some parts in the correct consistency while others are just in powder form. So if this happens, just add a little bit of water. So that it will start to bind properly. What if you have too much salt? Now, this is what it will look like when there's too much salt. You'll find that the edges are a little bit sharp and it's very crunchy. Also, they won't be able to bind properly. So if this happens, all you need to do is add more flour. So if let's say you got the ratio of the flour and salt wrong, how do we figure out what to add and how much to add? Just go by trial and error. If you find the modeling clay is now too flaky, just add more salt. If you find that it's too crunchy, add more flour. Just keep adding until you find that correct ratio. So for example, if there's already too much flour, you keep adding more flour, you'll find that it's increasing in flakiness. So which means now you need to add more salt. And if there's already too much salt and you keep adding more salt, you find it gets crispier, so then you need to add flour. And if it's too dry, like it is right now, then you need to add water. Now, what if we added too much water? Let's say we get an unfortunate scenario where we get soup like this instead. Honestly, if you get to this level, I'll just say throw this out and start again, because you need to add a lot of flour and salt in order to absorb all this water to get the modeling clay that we want. So it's not worth it, just throw this away, start all over again. And that's how you make your own modeling clay. Now, about this modeling clay, it can't keep for very long. So if you're wondering, oh, can I keep this for a long time and play with it in the future? Bad news, it won't. You'd have to throw it away after this session. And in case you're wondering, oh, can I make this modeling clay and use it for other purposes? For example, could we make our own volcanoes with it? It probably won't stay very long. And because it involves the use of water in its construction, obviously, if you use a modeling clay in a situation where you introduce more water to it, it's going to change the way the materials bind and it won't stick on for very long as well. So it's only good for just one session to play with, and that's all. But the good news is that now you know how to make the modeling clay. You can just bring out the flour and salt and your food coloring and just make your own modeling clay to have fun for that session. So now that you know how to make your own modeling clay, go crazy and go have fun. Do subscribe for more simple home experiments from your teacher, Miss Ho.